A quick update here, just at a loose end on a Friday morning. I have a vacation day, holiday day today, so I'm doing some painting and catching up on some miniature projects. Here we have these Monster Apocalypse models, which featured in the last video. They were clear resin models, so they were the sort of powered up versions of the miniatures in the Monster Apocalypse game, and a friend of mine had sent me a couple to paint up. I'm doing them in pairs so that I can send one of each of them back to him. The basic paint job was an airbrush, and I used Vallejo model air paints, and essentially on these ones I used a kind of a light desert sand colour for the sort of bulk of the body, and then the sort of armoured bits and the legs I used a slightly darker sort of khaki greeny sort of colour on them. And then I used an airbrush full of ink on the underside in here, and I was very quick with it. I mean, I'm doing these as sort of speed paint really. I'm not too fussed about making them perfect. You can see on one of them here, in fact, the red went over the edge a little bit along the back tail there, but the whole thing will look fine when it's dull coated. The airbrush colour I used was an ink for this red chest area, so you can see it's got a bit of a shine to it, which will improve again once the model's completely dull coated and finished. I was going for that sort of two-tone where the sort of darker armour carapace on the back has a slightly darker colour with the sort of red underbelly. To speed them up as fast as possible, over here I have two colours which I used. Should have made those a bit easier to grab to show you. This colour, which is kind of bane of my life, because whenever I use it I seem to spill it, or it comes oozing out along the side of the bottle. I featured these before when I started the initial paintwork on the 6mm models from GHQ, and I used it's called a filter. Essentially it's enamel, and is brilliant for going over acrylics. So when you're doing airbrushing on sort of models like this with acrylics, the next phase would be to use a filter, an enamel one. Now I prefer them to inks when you're doing a big job like these models, because they provide you a really smooth way of going into all of the sort of nooks and crannies on there. You can see how, again, if I show a side panel piece here, you can see how that enamel's gone up into all sort of edges along there. But there are two phases to that, because once you put that on, you leave it for 4 or 5 minutes to begin to dry, and the paint, or the enamel filter here, begins to get a little bit sticky. And once it is, you use a moistened brush. I use quite a large brush with some terps on. I happen to use this bottle, which they suggest is used for model oil colours as well, but it's just terps, essentially odorless terps, and you use that and it brushes off this enamel, and it works incredibly well actually. You don't need that much skill and it will smoothly brush it off. So unlike using your traditional familiar Games Workshop style inks, you're actually brushing that enamel off, and it doesn't leave any sort of cloggy bits behind like you'd expect with a drying enamel. So I thoroughly recommend that for a very quick result. That's what this was really, just a speed painting result. I wanted that enamel to go into the creases on the legs and things to speed my painting of such a large sort of bottle. There were two others with it as well, with the set which I'm doing, which are these sort of pterodactyl types. I mean, both of them have quite a comic, pulpy look to them, so ideal for games of that sort. In fact, I have some World War II tanks which I'm going to paint up as sort of vehicles to oppose these in that Japanese B-movie style and I think those tanks are rather nice. In fact, I can't remember which the particular model of tank that is, but it's from GHQ. So you can see here, obviously the green one has a lot of darker areas on there, and I used exactly the same technique by airbrushing on a sort of dark olive drab, I think it was, but then brushing on a lot of that enamel wash. And to brush that enamel wash on, I was using a very thick brush, this sort of size, and just painting it all over. Very quick technique. Then I used a slightly smaller brush, size 6, to dip into the terps, dry it off on the tissue, and then pull it off. So you can see how that's happened around the edge here where I'm putting the brush on. You can see it's very dark around there, and I've put terps onto this brush and dragged it off. And because the terp sort of cleans it off nicely, it leaves a very smooth result. So you can see the transition there between the sort of dark hand and the paler flesh of the wing. All that you can see along the top that's happened is that I'd airbrushed a slightly lighter tone just along the top of these scales. So there's no painting that's gone on to those scales. That's just me again using the terps and drawing the enamel off after it's had about 4 minutes to set on there. So that gets you that basic result. Obviously a little bit more to do on these, not much though. I'm not going to go to town on lots of detailing, particularly on those pterodactyl ones. I think they look quite good in that sort of dark green. Some things you can see, like the detailing I've done now with some acrylic paints, I've just put sort of those fingernails and things on. And in this instance they haven't been washed yet, so they look quite bright. They'll be toned down. And in fact this model has had his sort of toned down a bit. So the best place to sort of see that, I think, is on the mouth. If I put these up side by side, this chap here I've used, I shall pop it out, Reichland Flesh Shade. Just a note on these Games Workshop Citadel inks, there was a lot of sort of furore when they stopped doing the older Devlin Mud and Griffin Sepia. In fact, I still have little dregs of those left behind in some pots, but I found these new ones to be just as good, and they do a whole string of shades. In fact, I'd say Agrath Earthshade is similar to Devlin Mud, and I've been using this Reichland as my Griffin Sepia replacement. However, it has a little more reddish tone into it, I think, but it works fine. But anyway, you can see on these mouths where this one on the right here is a lot darker now into the crevices and around the teeth, and this guy over here, obviously it's still very bright, because I haven't put the Reichland shade in there. I just washed it in. I used this murderous magenta colour for the inside of the mouths, just painted it all in there, and for the actual teeth and all of the various claws and things, I think I've been using Jackbone, or it might be Menoth White Base. Can't remember. That's not very good, is it? But anyway, that will do either way. Oh no, it is Menoth White Base. Before I knock everything off to here, I could have gone on with Jackbone, but I'd use Menoth White Base essentially for things like the little fingernails and the toenails. Now, because these are just kind of like toy models really, they're rubbery, you can see the flexibility in there when I bounce that tail. There's lots of rubbery seams and things on there, and that I could have probably sanded off, but again, because I was just doing a quick paint job, trying to get something ready for the table, I've not been worried about picking all those details out. In fact, this chap here has had his wash done on that Menoth White base that I've put on the fingernails, so you can see it's darkened off the fingernails. The actual fingernails and things themselves have lots of faults and issues with them, where the rubber, when they've come out of the mould, has sort of got little torn edges and things. But again, not worried about that, just sort of rushing these through. But it's certainly worth doing the shading and using the wash Reichland Flesh Shade when you're doing these details, because it does improve the the overall look. Certainly his dark sort of mouth looks a lot more sort of interesting with the wash completed on it compared to one that's not been done. And what am I doing on the other one? So the other one, all I've done again is I've put that Reichland shade, actually no, sorry, the magenta, murderous magenta has gone into the tongue to give it that red look, and inside the beak, and I'll wash that as well. I won't do much more with that. I may use something like the Ard Coat, which is like a gloss varnish from Citadel, inside the mouths once the full job is done. So once I've done the basing and I've completely done all the little bits of details that I'm going to do on these, I might come back and just obviously dull coat them first with a can of spray, and then I might just paint some of that to give them a wet looking mouth. So there you go. I've got a couple of other things which I'll show while I'm on the video. I'm kind of painting these multi-scale, so I can use them for 15mm or 6mm gaming. Obviously you can see I've put little bits of Games Workshop Epic Ruin sprue and things, and there's a Ground Zero Games little vehicle, Jeep type vehicle on there as well. That's a 6mm scale one, but again it could look like a drone in 15mm if you're using it in 15mm. And I wanted to show this particular Gundam model. I've picked him up in Japan actually in April this year, and this is the set that it's from. It's called Fusion Works Mobile Suits Gundam, and they're in the sort of Bandai. You can see the Bandai logo, but they're in their sort of candy toy range. So again, he's sort of flexible friend. He came pre-painted actually, and you can see on the back of the card. Essentially, with this one, if I can get that glare out, they only really have two miniatures. They have the sort of Gundam suit style here, and then one of these ones, and then they just paint them in different colours and give them slightly different weapon, but everything else is identical. But it was about $3 or $4 I think when I picked it up in Japan. I could have got a few others at the same time, but I just stuck to one to keep the suitcase weight down. But I wanted to show you that card so you knew it was in this Fusion Works range if you were looking for one for your own 15mm or 6mm gaming. I think it will work with either. Scale wise, I imagine it's probably something like 1/250th, I would have thought, but I don't know. I know these guys are going to be very, very big as far as the Gundam sizing goes, so it might actually be suitable for 6mm gaming, but obviously clearly works for 28mm as well. The only other new thing that's come along recently is I've got a pack of these. They're very small scale, Dreampod 9, kind of fleet scale I think they call it, and one of their little walkers, and they do them in packs, heavy gear, fleet scale counter packs, so you get a whole stack of them in there, but they're the same model repeated over and over again basically. They do one for the northern and one for the southern factions, and they're quite similar really. I think really just the guy with the guns facing in the other direction, but there's a few minor details different on them. You can see they've got quite nice, I don't know if it's that visible, but they've got quite nice sort of backpacks and details. They'd be great for sort of 6mm gaming. Never played heavy gear, but I don't know what their fleet game is like, but obviously they're quite nice little models anyway. So that's my lot really, and just as a reminder, the models I've got which I'm painting up here from Monster Apocalypse, they came on these plastic bases. You can usually get them on eBay. In fact, I really, before anybody comments and says why don't you just play Monster Apocalypse, I do play actually. These happen to be spares a friend got hold of and sent to me, and I've got quite a few factions for Monster Apocalypse myself, so I do enjoy playing it. Just in this instance I decided to help him out by painting these models. So they were torn off those bases before they were put onto these metal bases.